For the last 40 years, we have been told to fear dietary fat and obsess over our LDL cholesterol. So, we stopped eating eggs, switched to low-fat diets packed with sugar and refined carbs, and inadvertently triggered the greatest epidemic of insulin resistance in human history. What if I told you that looking only at your LDL is like looking at the wrong side of the map? Today, we are exposing the real golden ratio of your lipid panel. I am not a doctor. This video is for educational purposes. Never stop taking your prescribed statins or heart medications without consulting your cardiologist. Stopping abruptly can be dangerous. Here is the part almost nobody was taught correctly. The low-fat era did not magically make people healthier. In many homes, fat was removed from the plate, but sugar and refined starch quietly rushed in to fill the gap. The American Heart Association has noted that when saturated fat is replaced with refined carbohydrates and sugar, there is no cardiovascular benefit. In other words, the problem was not simply fat. The problem was what replaced it. And that shift matters because your body does not experience sugar and refined starch as harmless. Your liver has to process that fuel. When energy intake is chronically higher than what your muscles and cells can use, the body packages the excess into triglycerides. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute describes triglycerides as fat found in the blood, produced in the liver, and notes that excess weight and metabolic dysfunction typically raise triglycerides and lower HDL. Metabolic syndrome is even called insulin resistance syndrome. That is why a person can be told their LDL is not that bad, while their real metabolic picture is quietly deteriorating in the background. HDL, meanwhile, is part of the cleanup crew. The American Heart Association says HDL helps carry LDL away from artery walls and back to the liver, where it can be broken down and removed. High triglycerides and low HDL are classic features of metabolic syndrome, the same insulin-resistant pattern that raises long-term cardiometabolic risk. So the real question is not just, what is my LDL? The deeper question is, what is my metabolism doing to my lipids? That is why we are going to start thinking like metabolic detectives, not cholesterol panic victims. In the next chapter, I will show you the ratio that reveals the hidden story behind insulin resistance, fat storage, and cardiovascular risk. Now let us talk about the number that often tells the real story: the triglyceride to HDL ratio. This is not a mysterious lab hack. It is simple math. You take your triglycerides and divide them by your HDL, using the same units. What you get is a rough metabolic signal. The higher the ratio, the more likely the body is struggling with insulin resistance and atherogenic dyslipidemia. That pattern is strongly associated with metabolic syndrome, which the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute also calls insulin resistance syndrome. Here is why this matters so much. Triglycerides are not just fat in your blood from eating healthy fat. They are a transport form of energy, and when the liver is overloaded with excess calories, especially from refined carbohydrates and sugar, it converts that surplus into triglycerides. High triglycerides commonly travel with low HDL, and that combination is a classic marker of metabolic dysfunction. The NHLBI explicitly lists high triglycerides and low HDL as core features of metabolic syndrome. Think of HDL as the cleanup crew. HDL helps carry cholesterol away from arteries and back to the liver for disposal. When HDL is too low, that cleanup system is less efficient. When triglycerides are too high, the ratio tilts in the wrong direction, and that tilt often reflects the same underlying problem. Insulin is no longer doing its job cleanly. The American Heart Association notes that HDL participates in reverse cholesterol transport, and that low HDL with high triglycerides is part of the unfavorable lipid pattern seen in cardiometabolic risk. This is why many functional and metabolic clinicians pay close attention to the TG to HDL ratio instead of staring at LDL in isolation. In some studies and clinical discussions, a ratio around 3.0 or higher is used as a warning sign for insulin resistance or impaired glucose handling, although the exact cutoff can vary by population and lab context. The key idea is not worshipping a single number. The key is recognizing the metabolic pattern behind the numbers. A ratio near 1:1 is often treated by integrative clinicians as a sign that the system is relatively calm, while higher ratios suggest that the liver may be overproducing triglycerides and HDL may be running low. That does not mean one number gives you your whole diagnosis. It means the ratio gives you a better window into insulin sensitivity than LDL alone. In other words, LDL can be one chapter in the story, but the triglyceride to HDL ratio tells you whether the plot is drifting toward insulin resistance. And this is why people can eat low-fat for years and still not feel well. If the diet is built on juice, bread, crackers, cereal, pasta, snack bars, and constant grazing, the liver keeps receiving a steady stream of glucose. When glucose delivery is persistent, insulin rises to manage it. Over time, that environment pushes the body toward fat storage, lower HDL, and higher triglycerides. That is not a cholesterol problem first. That is an insulin problem first. So before you panic about LDL, ask a better question. What is my triglyceride to HDL ratio telling me about insulin resistance, liver output, and metabolic stress? That is the beginning of real prevention. Because when the ratio is moving in the wrong direction, the body is not whispering. It is sending a very clear message that the fuel system needs to be repaired. In the next chapter, we will trace that message back to the blood sugar surge that starts it all. Now let us connect the dots. Imagine a bagel, a glass of juice, a pastry, or a bowl of white rice. Those foods do not just disappear into thin air. They are rapidly broken down into glucose, and that glucose has to go somewhere. When the flow is constant and the body is already insulin resistant, the liver becomes the processing hub for excess fuel. This is where the problem starts to move from blood sugar into blood fats. The American Heart Association notes that refined carbohydrates, such as white flour or white rice, can affect triglycerides, and that sugar and refined carbs are not a cardiovascular upgrade when they simply replace healthy fats. The liver's response to excess sugar is not random. It can convert that surplus into triglycerides and package them for transport in the bloodstream. Over time, frequent sugar overload encourages a higher triglyceride environment. Research on fructose and hepatic metabolism shows that overconsumption can promote insulin resistance, oxidative stress, inflammation, and elevated triglycerides, while glucose-fructose diets are linked to increased liver lipogenesis and VLDL triglyceride output. In plain English, the liver can turn sugar into circulating fat. This is the biochemical trap of insulin resistance. The body needs more and more insulin to manage the same meal, yet glucose handling becomes less efficient. The NHLBI describes insulin resistance as a central feature of metabolic syndrome, and that syndrome is defined by the exact pattern we keep seeing: high triglycerides, low HDL, elevated glucose, and abdominal metabolic dysfunction. So the issue is not simply eating too much fat. It is a fuel processing problem driven by repeated exposure to refined carbohydrates and sugar. And here is where HDL starts to fall. In insulin resistance, the lipid system shifts toward the unfavorable pattern we call atherogenic dyslipidemia. Triglycerides rise, HDL tends to drop, and the particles become more dangerous overall. One review explains that insulin resistance is associated with increased hepatic triglyceride lipase, which can accelerate HDL clearance and reduce HDL cholesterol levels. So when your TG to HDL ratio worsens, it is not just a number on paper. It is a signal that the cleanup crew is getting overwhelmed. Now connect that to the arteries. The CDC explains that over time, high blood sugar can damage blood vessels, and that high triglycerides together with low HDL contribute to hardening of the arteries. The American Heart Association also notes that people with diabetes are at greater risk of atherosclerosis and other vascular disease. This is the real danger of chronic metabolic dysfunction. The bloodstream becomes more inflammatory, the vessel lining becomes more vulnerable, and plaque has an easier time taking root. So the sugar story is not just about weight gain or energy crashes. It is about what repeated glucose overload does to the liver, the lipids, the HDL cleanup system, and eventually the blood vessels themselves. That is why the TG to HDL ratio is so revealing. It shows you the metabolic consequence of the fuel you are eating, not just the cholesterol headline you were taught to fear. Next, we will talk about the statin conversation in a calm, medical, and practical way. Now we need to have a calm, intelligent conversation about statins. If your doctor prescribed one, the goal is usually straightforward. Lower LDL cholesterol and reduce cardiovascular risk. Statins are effective medicines, and for many people they are life-saving. But every powerful tool has a physiology attached to it, and statins are no exception. The FDA's cholesterol medicine guide lists muscle pain, tenderness, or weakness as recognized adverse effects, and the American Heart Association notes that statin-associated muscle symptoms can occur in some patients. Here is the key biochemical point. Statins work by inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase in the mevalonate pathway. That pathway does not only help make cholesterol, it also helps produce intermediates involved in coenzyme Q10 synthesis. NIA's Stat-Pearl's review on CoQ10 explains that statins inhibit an intermediate in the mevalonate pathway, and researchers have long theorized that this may contribute to lower CoQ10 availability. And that matters because CoQ10 is deeply tied to cellular energy production. It sits inside the mitochondria, where it helps shuttle electrons and support ATP generation. You can think of it as part of the spark system for the cell's engine. When people complain of fatigue, heavy legs, or muscle aching while taking a statin, the conversation often turns to mitochondrial energy and the possibility that CoQ10 may be part of the picture. That mechanism is biologically plausible, even though not every person experiences symptoms, and not every study finds the same degree of benefit from supplementation. This is where the discussion must stay balanced. Muscle symptoms do not automatically mean a person should abandon statin therapy, and muscle pain is not proof that a medicine is bad. The smarter response is to talk with the prescribing clinician about the symptom pattern, timing, dose, medication interactions, and whether a supportive strategy makes sense. The FDA advises patients to report unexplained muscle pain, tenderness, or weakness, especially if it is severe or persistent. That is the conversation. Not fear, but informed monitoring. So the diplomatic takeaway is simple. Statins can lower LDL, but the body still needs energy at the mitochondrial level. If someone on a statin is dealing with muscle fatigue, it is reasonable to ask the doctor about CoQ10 support, because that conversation is about protecting muscle function, not rejecting treatment. The goal is not to panic. The goal is to personalize the plan. So here is the root cause truth. You do not fix a bad triglyceride to HDL ratio by staring harder at LDL. You fix it by improving insulin sensitivity. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute says heart-healthy lifestyle changes are the first line of treatment for metabolic syndrome. And the American Heart Association notes that physical activity can lower triglycerides and raise HDL. That is why the real solution starts with the terrain, not with panic. Step 1 is to lower the fuel load that keeps the liver overworked. The American Heart Association's dietary guidance says refined carbohydrates and sugars can raise triglycerides and reduce HDL, which is exactly why a low-fat diet built on bread, crackers, juice, cereal, and sweets can backfire. The goal is not fear of food. The goal is smarter food structure. More real protein, more fiber, more minimally processed carbohydrates, and fewer refined starches that keep insulin high. Step 2 is to build insulin-sensitive muscle. Muscle is not just for appearance. It is one of the largest places your body stores and burns glucose. The NHLBI says regular physical activity can lower triglycerides and raise HDL. And the AHA/ACC prevention guideline encourages resistance exercise because it improves glycemic control and delivers broader cardiometabolic benefits. In plain language, when muscle gets stronger, glucose gets handled better. Step 3 is where a premium metabolic support protocol can fit in as an adjunct. Not as a replacement. Not as a miracle. As support. If someone is trying to stay consistent with healthier glucose handling, a well-formulated blood sugar and metabolic support plan can be part of a larger strategy that includes food, movement, sleep, and medical guidance. That is the only honest way to position it. As a helper for the process, not the hero of the story. So here is the blueprint. Lower refined carbs, increase protein and fiber, lift weights, walk more, and support the system consistently. That is how you improve the golden ratio from the inside out. Always consult your doctor before starting a new protocol, especially if you take medications for blood sugar, cholesterol, or blood pressure. And never stop any prescribed medicine without speaking to your clinician first.